Case 1. Jennifer Pan. She made the call to 911 herself. Sobbing, terrified, she told the operator that 3 strangers had forced their way into her family home and tied her to the staircase. What the police would slowly come to understand is that the young woman crying on the line had let those men in. She had paid them, and the people they came for were the 2 who had raised her. Jennifer Pan grew up in Markham, a quiet suburb just outside Toronto, the daughter of Vietnamese immigrants who had arrived in Canada with almost nothing and built a stable life through long hours and strict rules. Her parents wanted the very best for her, and in their minds that meant top grades, piano, and a career in medicine. The pressure never let up. Somewhere along the way, Jennifer stopped meeting it and started faking it. For years, she lied. She forged report cards. She pretended she had finished high school with honours when she had not. She told her parents she had been accepted to a top university and was training to become a pharmacist. And she kept that lie alive for years, faking textbooks, faking a schedule, even pretending to leave for classes that did not exist. Her whole life had become a performance staged for an audience of 2 people she could not bear to disappoint and could not bring herself to obey. Underneath the lies was a boyfriend her parents had forbidden her to see, a man named Daniel Wong, and a slow, simmering resentment. Jennifer wanted out. She wanted her freedom. She wanted Daniel, and by the account that came out later, she wanted the money too. Her parents had savings and a home, and she believed she stood to inherit around $500,000 once they were gone. So she decided they should be gone. Jennifer did not plan to do it herself. Working with Daniel, she went looking for someone who would. The first man he connected her with was reportedly offered around $1,500 to kill her father, and he turned it down. The search did not stop there. Daniel introduced her to another man, Lenford Crawford, and this time the arrangement held. The price climbed to around $10,000, money Jennifer promised to pay out of the inheritance she was expecting. Crawford pulled in a second man, who pulled in a third, until there was a small crew assembled for a single night's work. On the 8th of November 2010, Jennifer's mother, Bik Ha Pan, came home from her weekly line dancing class. Later that evening, Jennifer quietly unlocked the front door. Around 10 at night, 3 men walked into the house and forced her parents down to the basement. Bik Ha, 53 years old, was shot twice in the head and died there. Jennifer's father, Han, 60, was shot in the face and the shoulder and left for dead. He did not die. That one fact unravelled everything. After the men fled, Jennifer made her frantic call, describing a home invasion and a robbery, insisting she had been tied to the banister upstairs while her parents were attacked below. But her father survived, spent 3 days in a medically induced coma, and when he came out of it, his memory of that night did not match his daughter's story at all. Investigators had already noticed the cracks. Jennifer was strangely calm. Her account kept shifting, and when detectives pulled the phone records and the text messages, they found a trail that led straight back to her, to Daniel, and to the men who had walked through that unlocked door. Under questioning, Jennifer finally admitted she had staged the whole thing, though she tried to twist it, claiming at one point that she had wanted the men to kill her, not her mother. The jury did not buy it. In 2014, Jennifer Pan, Daniel Wong, and 2 of the gunmen were convicted of first-degree murder in the death of her mother and attempted murder in the shooting of her father. She was sentenced to life with no chance at parole for 25 years. Even that verdict was not the end of it. Years later, an appeals court ruled that the jury should have been given the option to weigh lesser charges in her mother's death, and it ordered a new trial on the murder count. The case climbed all the way to the Supreme Court of Canada, which agreed, and in 2026, rather than face that new trial, Jennifer Pan pleaded guilty to manslaughter in her mother's death. She is still serving a life sentence. The difference now is that she is finally eligible to ask for parole, and her conviction for trying to kill her father still stands. Her father lived. He lost his wife, testified against his own child, and had to carry the knowledge that the daughter he had pushed so hard had unlocked the door and let his killers walk in. Her story would later reach millions through a documentary, but the coldest detail never changed. She shopped for men who would do it, settled on a price, and paid, and the target was the family that made her. Jennifer Pan wanted her freedom and a payday, and she was willing to unlock a door to get both. The daughter we turn to next wanted something far larger. She was convinced a fortune worth millions was waiting for her, and to reach it, she handed two young men the floor plan of her own home and the code to shut off the alarm. Case 2. Christy Koslow. She was the daughter of a wealthy Texas family, and she had convinced herself that a fortune was coming to her. All she had to do was remove the two people standing between her and the money. So she found two young men, drew them a map of the house, handed over the code to the alarm, and promised them a payday most people only imagine. Christy Koslow grew up in Fort Worth, Texas, in a world most kids only see in movies. Her father, Jack Koslow, was a helicopter pilot who had married into serious wealth. Her stepmother, Karen, came from a rich petroleum family and was known around the city as a warm and generous woman who gave her time and money to charity. To the outside world, Christy had everything. Inside, she was a teenager who had decided that the people providing that comfortable life were the only things standing between her and a fortune of her own. She was 17. By her own later account, she believed that with her father and stepmother out of the way, she could inherit an estate she valued at as much as $12 million. When the truth finally came out, Christy did not fall apart or beg for forgiveness. By her own account, it had all been about the money, and she showed little sign of remorse for the two people who had given her a comfortable life. She had simply decided that comfort was not enough. What makes her case so chilling is how businesslike she was about it. There was no sudden explosion of rage. She recruited. Her boyfriend at the time was a 19-year-old named Brian Salter, and through him she brought in his friend, Jeffrey Dillingham, also 19. The offer she reportedly put on the table was staggering. The two of them were promised as much as $1 million once the inheritance came through. To make sure the job went smoothly, Christy gave them the tools of an inside job. She provided a layout of the house. She gave them the code to switch off the family alarm. She turned her own home into an easy target and pointed two teenagers straight at her parents. On the 12th of March, 1992, the two young men entered the Koslow home at night through a rear door, using the code to slip past the alarm. They found Jack and Karen, forced them to the floor, and attacked them with a steel bar. Karen Koslow, 40 years old, was beaten and her throat was cut, and she did not survive. Jack was beaten and cut as well, and by every reasonable expectation he should have died too. Somehow, he lived. To dress it up as a robbery gone wrong, the attackers grabbed a watch and a little cash on their way out. It was not nearly enough to fool anyone for long. At first, suspicion actually landed on Jack himself, the way it often does with a surviving spouse. The investigation moved past him quickly. Once police leaned on the two young attackers, the story spilled out. Dillingham confessed and laid out the whole arrangement, naming Salter and naming the 17-year-old girl who had drawn the map and supplied the code. The inside job had an inside source, and she was the dead woman's own stepdaughter. The cases moved through the Texas courts one at a time. Brian Salter agreed to plead guilty and testify against Christy in exchange for a life sentence. Jeffrey Dillingham took his chances at a trial, lost, and was sentenced to death. Christy Koslow was convicted of capital murder in 1994. The jury could not agree on sending her to death row, so she received a life sentence instead. In the years that followed, the book closed on the men. Jeffrey Dillingham was executed by lethal injection in the year 2000, at just 27 years old, still paying for a murder he committed at 19 for a fortune he never touched. Brian Salter remains behind bars serving life. Christy is still in a Texas prison, her earliest shot at parole arriving near the end of this decade. Her father, the man who survived that night and lost his wife to his own daughter's greed, lived on until 2023. Karen, the stepmother who had spent so much of her life giving to other people, never got the chance to grow old. She died in her own home at the hands of two teenagers her stepdaughter had aimed at her like a weapon. Think about the arithmetic of it. A teenager looked at the two people raising her, put a price on their lives, and decided that a share of an inheritance was worth more than a mother and a father. She did not even lift the bar herself. She recruited two teenage boys with a promise of money that, in the end, none of them would ever see. and she sent them into the dark with a map she had drawn by hand. Christy Koslow dangled the fantasy of millions in front of two boys who trusted her. The woman in our next case was blunter about the deal. She named a flat price, $20,000, to have not one, but two members of her own family taken out, and she reached for a shooter she barely knew to carry it out. If cold cases like this one pull you in, subscribe. It is free, and it keeps these investigations coming. Case 3. Samantha Ford Raybon. Two men were found dead outside a home near Conway, South Carolina. A father and his grown son, both shot at close range, their vehicle burned in a field. For nearly 2 years the case sat cold. When it finally cracked, it led back to a woman who had offered a near stranger $20,000 to wipe out 2 branches of her own family tree, all for an inheritance worth about $1 million. Samantha Ford Raybon was in her mid-30s when she decided that the fastest road to a fortune ran straight through her own father and half-brother. Her father, Robert Ford Jr., was 59. Her half-brother, Robbie Ford, was just 25. Between them stood a family estate, land and money that Samantha reportedly valued at more than $1 million, and she wanted all of it, and she wanted it soon. Robert Ford Jr. was a man in his late 50s who should have had years still ahead of him, and Robbie was only 25, barely into adult life. To the people who knew them, they were simply a father and his son. Samantha saw something else. She saw a wall between herself and an estate, and she had decided that wall had to come down. So she went looking for a gun for hire. Samantha had no underworld connections of her own, but she had a cousin named Teresa Martin, and Teresa was dating a man named Randy Granger. Through that link, the offer was made. Granger later described it plainly to a jury. He said Teresa asked him whether he would kill somebody for $20,000, and he answered that he guessed he would. Samantha even supplied the weapon. About a year earlier, she had quietly taken a handgun from her own father, and that stolen gun became the one turned back on him. The message she sent was cold and exact. Prosecutors told the court that Samantha wanted her father and her brother taken care of before a certain deadline, so that she could inherit everything. Taken care of, as though they were errands to be crossed off a list. On the 17th of August 2018, Randy Granger ambushed the two men in the dark behind the family home. Robert Ford Jr. was shot twice in the head. Robbie Ford was shot in the side and then in the back of the head. Both died. To cover the trail, Robbie's vehicle was driven out to a field and set on fire. The bodies were discovered the next day when someone came to check on them. Then the case went quiet. For close to 2 years, detectives had 2 murders, a burned-out vehicle, and no clear suspect. What finally broke it open was science. Investigators recovered DNA from cigarette butts and the nick cap in and around the burned vehicle, and they handed it to a specialised lab that builds family trees out of genetic material, the same kind of science that has cracked cold cases left untouched for decades. That work pointed them to a name they had never once considered, a man called Randy Granger. Once they had Granger, the phone records tied him to Teresa Martin, and on the 2nd anniversary of the killings, detectives sat Teresa down and she began to talk. She told them the plain and ugly truth. Samantha had hired Granger to kill her own father for $20,000. The evidence against Samantha kept stacking up. A detective testified about the searches investigators traced to her, unsettling questions about how fast a person could get a passport and how long after a murder detectives usually search someone's phone. There was also a large amount of deleted data, the digital version of scrubbing a crime scene, and there was her behaviour after the killings. Rather than grieve, Samantha moved to collect, chasing down the inheritance and the insurance money that the 2 deaths would bring her. Her hired hands fell first. Randy Granger was convicted in 2023 of both murders and given 2 consecutive life sentences. Teresa Martin, the cousin who made the introduction, pleaded guilty to a lesser role. Then it was Samantha's turn. In February of 2024, she stood trial, and a jury convicted her on every count: 2 murders, 2 counts of conspiracy, and 2 counts of solicitation. The judge handed down 2 life sentences without parole, stacked on top of an additional 30 years. For the Ford family, no sentence could undo any of it. Relatives sat in that courtroom and spoke about the father and son who had been stolen from them by the one person who was supposed to love them most. One more detail told you everything about the motive. With her father and brother dead, Samantha stood to inherit an estate worth more than $1 million, along with insurance money on top of it. That fortune was the entire reason two men were lying dead in the dark. No one had wronged her, and no one had threatened her. She looked at her own father and brother and saw a payout, and she found a man willing to pull a trigger for a flat fee. Samantha Rabin was a grown woman who reached for a stranger with a gun. The girl in our next case had barely started high school. She was 15 years old when she went looking for someone to kill her parents, and the crew she pulled together came from the people closest to her. Case 4. Dahlia Bolin. When the deputies arrived, the 15-year-old told them she had been hiding in the basement while intruders shot her parents. Her mother was already dead on the couch. Her father, hit several times, was somehow still breathing. Within 48 hours, investigators would learn that the frightened girl who called for help had arranged the entire attack, and that she had promised the shooters a small fortune from her own parents' life insurance. Dahlia Bolin lived with her parents in Mackinac, a small town in central Illinois, the kind of quiet place where a murder-for-hire plot is the last thing anyone would picture. She was 15 years old. By every account, she was having trouble at home, friction with her father in particular, the sort of conflict that in almost any other family ends with slammed doors and cools off within a week. In Dahlia's case, it ended with a plan to have her parents killed. At the start, that plan reportedly centered on her father alone, the parent she was clashing with. Somewhere along the way, it grew to swallow her mother as well, until both of the people who had raised her were marked for the very same night. Her mother was Rebecca Bolin, 51. Her father was Douglas, 52. They were ordinary people living an ordinary life in a small Illinois town. The kind of couple whose biggest worry should have been a teenager's bad mood. They had no idea that the danger inside their home was not an intruder from the outside. It was their own daughter. Dahlia's plan was built around people she knew. Her boyfriend was a 20-year-old named Nathaniel Maloney. Through him and her own circle, she brought in two others, a young man named Andre Street, who was around 18, and a getaway driver named Sage Royber, who was 21. None of them were hardened criminals. They were young people in her orbit, and she pulled them into a killing with the promise of a payout. What she offered them was not pocket money. She promised the group around $100,000, money that would come from her parents' life insurance once they were dead. To arm them, she handed over her father's own guns. The plot was arranged mostly through phones and messages, the way teenagers plan almost everything. The night before the killing, Royber drove two of the young men to the house to collect the weapons. Then, on the 22nd of October 2021, they came back to finish it. Around 9:15 that evening, the gunmen slipped in through the basement and opened fire on Rebecca and Douglas inside the home. Rebecca died. Douglas was shot several times and, like so many of the fathers in these stories, refused to die. In their rush, the shooters fled without staging the fake robbery they had planned, and Dahlia, playing the part of the terrified daughter, told deputies she had been hiding in the basement when it happened. The story fell apart almost at once. Her account kept shifting. Douglas, wounded but alive, was able to tell investigators that the guns used to shoot him were his own. Detectives also recovered the group texts and video chats where the four of them had laid out the entire plan. Within 48 hours, all four of them were in custody, and both weapons had been recovered. Because of how serious the crime was, a judge ruled that Dahlia would be tried as an adult, even though she had been just 15 when she set the plot in motion. In January of 2024, she and all three of the others pleaded guilty. Dahlia admitted to first-degree murder, attempted murder, and soliciting the killing of her parents for hire. The sentences came down hard. Dahlia received 60 years, Nathaniel Maloney got 66, Andre Street received 55. Sage Royber, the driver, was given 30. With credit for the time she had already spent locked up, Dahlia is expected to serve somewhere close to 54 years. A girl who was 15 on the night of the murder will most likely be an old woman before she ever walks free, if that day comes at all. The case drew coverage across the country, a story a lot of people struggled to believe. The most haunting piece of the whole case came from one of the people she recruited, who described Dahlia in the days before the murders as giddy, almost cheerful, as though she were counting down to a holiday rather than the deaths of her mother and father. She was 15. She had a boyfriend, a phone, and a grudge, and she turned all three into a plan to cash in on her parents' lives. And here is the cruel twist of it. Douglas Bolin survived being shot by young men his own 15-year-old daughter had armed and paid. He lived through the attack only to face the truth that the person behind it was the child he had raised. His wife did not survive at all. Dahlia Bolin acted out of money and a grudge she could not release. Our last daughter for now was driven by something else entirely. She was a 17-year-old honours student, and the thing she could not stand to lose was a boy. Her parents tried to keep them apart, so she paid two young men to make sure her parents would never stand in her way again. Do us one small favour before the next case. Hit subscribe so these stories keep landing on your feed, at no cost to you. Case 5. Tia Skinner. By every account, she was a model student, bright and easy to like. But when her parents grounded her and tried to end her relationship, her response went somewhere no one saw coming. She drew a map of her own house, marked the path to her parents' bedroom, left a window open, and paid two young men to climb through it in the dark. Tia Skinner lived in Yale, a small town in Michigan, and on paper she was the last kid anyone would worry about. She was 17, an honours student, the sort of teenager adults trust without a second thought. Behind that clean image was a girl consumed by her relationship with her boyfriend, an 18-year-old named Jonathan Kurtz, and a rising anger at the two people trying to slow that relationship down. Her father was Paul Skinner, 47, a pipe fitter and a devoted member of his church. Her mother, Mara, was a middle school teacher. Like a lot of parents of teenagers, they had reached a limit. They grounded Tia, they took away her phone, and they told her the relationship with Jonathan had to end. For most families, that is the start of a rough few months. For Tia Skinner, it was the start of a murder plot. What she did next reads less like a teenage tantrum and more like a contract. Tia recruited her boyfriend Jonathan and his friend, an 18-year-old named James Preston, and she offered to pay them. The figure that came out later was strikingly small, about $1,000 for both of them. For that price, she wanted her parents dead. She did not simply point them at the house and hope for the best. She planned it. Tia drew a map of her own home by hand, labelled it as her house, and marked an arrow pointing straight to her parents' bedroom. She warned them about the creaky floors so the noise would not wake her parents too soon. Her instructions were chillingly practical. The later the better, she told them, and try to make it look like a break-in gone wrong. Just after midnight on the 12th of November 2010, two masked young men climbed through that window and attacked Paul and Mara Skinner in their bedroom. Paul, wounded, managed to chase the attackers out of the house before he collapsed and died. Mara was stabbed more than 20 times and, against all odds, survived. The couple's grown son was also home that night and rushed into the chaos. Paul died just outside his own front door, still trying to drive off the young men his daughter had sent. He was 47, a working man and a churchgoer, the kind of father who thought the hardest part of raising a teenager was grounding her and taking away her phone. What gave Tia away was the same thing that undid so many of these daughters. She was too calm. On the ride with police, she chatted about school and college as if it were any other day. She never once asked about her parents, never asked whether they were alive. Then there was the map, found outside the house, a hand-drawn diagram pointing to the very room where the attack took place. Within hours, the pieces came together, and all three teenagers were under arrest. The convictions followed one after another. Jonathan Kurtz, then James Preston, then Tia herself in the summer of 2011, were all found guilty of first-degree murder, attempted murder, and conspiracy. Under Michigan law at the time, that carried an automatic sentence of life without the possibility of parole. Tia's case, though, became tangled in a larger legal fight. Because she had been under 18 when she committed the crime, a wave of court rulings limiting automatic life terms for young offenders forced the courts to revisit her sentence more than once. Each time, The case came back to what she had done, the planning, the map, the calm, and each time she was sent back to prison. Her two accomplices, both 18 at the time of the crime, were never eligible for those juvenile reviews and are serving life. Mara Skinner had to live with all of it. She survived more than 20 stab wounds delivered by young men her own daughter had hired. She lost her husband, and she had to sit in a courtroom and take in the fact that the person who planned it, who drew the map to their bedroom, was the child she had raised. In the years since, she retired from teaching and has spent time volunteering in the prosecutor's office on behalf of crime victims, trying to build something meaningful out of a night that took almost everything from her. Tia Skinner was 17. She had good grades, a future, every door open to her. She threw it all away over a boyfriend, and she did it coldly, with a pen, a map, and a price of $500 a head. She had done her killing by proxy and by design. The next girl on this list tried the very same thing. She went hunting for someone to hire, and when that plan fell through, she simply put her father's own gun into her boyfriend's hands and steered him toward the bedroom where her parents slept. Case 6. Chrissy Caldwell. She wanted her parents dead, and she was willing to pay for it. The trouble was that nobody she approached would take the job for the price she was offering. So this 17-year-old did the next best thing in her mind. She put her own father's gun into her boyfriend's hands and sent him into the house while her parents slept. Chrissy Caldwell lived in Frisco, Texas, and by 17 she had built up a deep and simmering hatred for her parents, her mother most of all. She wanted out of that house, she wanted her boyfriend, and she wanted the freedom she felt her parents were holding just out of reach. Her boyfriend was a young man named Bobby Gonzalez, and their relationship was exactly the kind her parents had tried to shut down. Rather than run away or wait until she was older, Chrissy decided her parents simply had to go, and her first instinct was to hire the job out. In the week before the killing, she and Gonzalez looked for someone they could pay to kill her mother and father. She even tried to induce another man to carry it out, but no one she approached was willing to do it, and the idea of a paid stranger fell through. So the plan changed. With no hired stranger willing to take the job, Chrissy turned to the person already closest to her. She took a pistol that belonged to her own father and handed it to Bobby Gonzalez. On the night of the 6th of March 1992, in the early hours of the morning, Chrissy opened the door and let Gonzalez inside. He walked to her parents' bedroom and shot them as they slept. Her mother, Rosalind Caldwell, 41 years old, was hit and died. Her father, Vernon, was seriously wounded but survived. Investigators worked backward from the shooting and quickly identified Gonzalez as the gunman, and from there, the conspiracy behind it came apart. What they uncovered was chilling. Chrissy had fed Gonzalez a lie to justify the killing, telling him that her father had abused her and that her mother had allowed it, a story Gonzalez would only later learn was false. As investigators pieced the case together, the picture of a teenage girl who had orchestrated her own parents' deaths came into focus. At trial, prosecutors painted her as the planner, rather than a bystander swept along by a reckless boyfriend. The jury heard how she had first tried to hire a stranger to carry out the killing, and how, when that fell through, she had turned to the boyfriend who would do it for her. By the time the evidence was in, there was little doubt that the deaths had been her design from the start. Because her attempt to hire a killer sat at the centre of what she had done, Chrissy Caldwell was charged with and convicted of solicitation of capital murder. She had tried to buy the killing, and when that failed, she had armed the person who carried it out. In November of 1992, a jury sentenced her to life in prison. The prosecutor told the courtroom they were looking at someone with absolutely no regard for human life. Her conviction was later upheld on appeal. Bobby Gonzalez, who was only 15 or 16 himself when he pulled the trigger, was convicted of capital murder for a killing committed during a break-in, and he too was sentenced to life. Reporting on the case over the years has pointed to the couple's forbidden relationship and her parents' disapproval of it as part of what pushed Chrissy toward that decision. What lingers about the Caldwell case is how ordinary the spark was and how far she was willing to go to answer it. A grounded teenager, a boyfriend her parents did not like, a house that felt like a cage. In countless families, that same story ends with shouting matches and a few miserable months. In Chrissy's, it ended with her mother shot dead in her own bed and her father waking to gunfire, wounded, slowly realizing that the person who had let the shooter in was his own daughter. Vernon Caldwell survived that night, but he had to live with the truth of it, that the child he had raised had wanted him dead badly enough to put a gun in the hands of the boy who fired it. Decades on, the case still turns up in true crime programming as a warning about a child who plotted a parent's murder. Bobby Gonzalez, sent to prison for life as a teenager, has spent his adult life behind bars and has sought to appeal his sentence. 2 teenagers threw away everything they had, and one parent was left dead, over a relationship and a house that had come to feel too small. Chrissy had wanted a hired gun and settled for a boyfriend with her father's pistol. Our next case had no trouble at all finding professionals. She reached out into her community, into the world of contract killers for hire, and she paid them well to walk into her father's bedroom while he slept. If you are still with us, tap that subscribe button. It costs you nothing, and it helps us keep digging into cases like these. Case 7. Molagadi Melape. A respected school official was shot to death in his own bed, his home staged to look like the scene of a robbery. For a while, it looked like a break-in that had turned deadly, but the person who had unlocked the gate and the front door for the killers was the man's own daughter, and she had promised them 200,000 rand to do it. Dr. Malakutu Johannes Melape was a respected man in Limpopo, South Africa, a circuit manager in the provincial education department, the kind of person a whole community looks up to. He lived in Mankweng, near Polokwane, and in December of 2023, he was murdered in his own home by men his daughter had hired. His daughter was Molagadi Magdalene Melape, 28 years old. What set her down this path was not money in the ordinary sense, but a poisonous belief. Her mother had died, and a traditional healer had told Molagadi that her father was responsible, that he had used traditional medicine to cause her mother's death. That accusation took root in her. According to prosecutors, Molagadi first tried to take her revenge through traditional means, and when that did not work, she turned to something far more direct. What makes it harder to fathom is how ordinary the rest of her life looked. She was a young mother herself, raising a small child, moving through daily life in the same community as the father she had decided to destroy. There was no long history of violence between them in the public record, only a healer's accusation and a daughter who chose to believe it completely. She decided to have her father killed, and she was willing to pay for it. Working with several family members, Molagadi arranged to hire a contract killer, agreeing to a price of 200,000 rand. The plan needed someone on the inside, and that someone was her. On the night of the killing, the 28th of December 2023, Molagadi unlocked the gate and the main door of the family home so the hired men could reach her sleeping father without a struggle. They shot Dr. Melape several times in his bed. Then, to disguise what had really happened, they took his cell phone and other valuables and staged the scene to look like a robbery gone wrong. For a short time, the staging held, but the investigation in Limpopo moved quickly. Within weeks, police working alongside private security had made arrests in Mankweng and in a nearby town, recovering a vehicle and a firearm believed to be connected to the killing. As the case came together, the staged robbery fell away, and the truth underneath it surfaced. The killing had been planned and paid for, arranged and enabled by the victim's own child. The co-accused included the men alleged to have carried out the shooting and a traditional healer said to be tied to the plot. Molagadi's own role, though, was the one that undid any sympathy. She had unlocked the gate and the door. She had helped arrange the payment. She had pointed the hired men toward the bedroom where her father slept. Whatever a healer had whispered to her, the choice to open that door was hers alone. When the case reached the Polokwane High Court, Molagadi Melape pleaded guilty to the murder of her father and to robbery. In June of 2025, she was sentenced to life imprisonment for the murder, with an added 15 years for the robbery, the terms to run at the same time. The state made clear it did not read her guilty plea as genuine remorse, so much as a response to the weight of the evidence stacked against her. Prosecutors noted that a guilty plea in the face of such a strong case says more about the odds than about a change of heart. One of the men linked to the killing later pleaded guilty as well, and was handed roughly 20 years for the murder, on top of more than a decade for the robbery, the terms to run at the same time. The murder sent a shock through the community in Limpopo. A well-known educator, a man who had spent his career helping schools and students, had been gunned down in his sleep on the word of a traditional healer and the decision of his own daughter. The belief that set it all in motion, that he had somehow caused her mother's death through witchcraft, was never anything more than an accusation. There was no evidence he had harmed anyone. He simply became the target of a story his daughter chose to believe, and she was willing to pay 200,000 rand to make that story end in his death. For the schools and colleagues who had relied on Dr. Malape, the loss was doubled by the horror of who was behind it. A man who had spent his life opening doors for young people in his province had died because his own daughter opened a door for the men sent to kill him. Molagadi Malape killed over a twisted idea of revenge. What drove the woman who comes next was pure arithmetic. She had taken out insurance policies on 2 of her own relatives, and she hired a gunman to turn that paper into cash. Case 8. Kaletsang Motladile. She had quietly taken out life insurance policies on 2 members of her own family, worth close to 350,000 rand. Then she found a gunman, paid him a small fraction of that, and sent him to collect. When her aunt and her cousin were shot dead in their home, she was already the name waiting on the payout. In the Free State province of South Africa, near Thaba and Chu, a woman named Kaletsang Martha Motladile worked out a simple and heartless piece of math. If she insured the lives of 2 relatives and then made sure those relatives died, the money would come to her. For Kaletsang, this was a business decision, worked out on paper before a single shot was fired, cold from the very first step. So that is exactly what she set out to do. The 2 people she chose were family. One was her aunt, Lesang Sarah Motladile. The other was her cousin, Bongani Goodwill Motladile, her aunt's son. These were close kin, an aunt and her grown son, people who trusted her and had no reason to imagine she had quietly built a plan around their deaths. Kaletsang held life and funeral policies on them, worth close to 350,000 rand, and to turn that paper into a payout, she needed them dead. She did not attempt it herself. Kaletsang hired a hitman, a man named Malefi Molise, and paid him around 29,000 rand to carry out the killings. It was a brutal bargain. For a small share of the money she stood to collect, Molise agreed to murder 2 people he had no quarrel with. To the man she hired, it was simply a job. For Kaletsang, it was an investment, a few thousand rands spent now against a far larger sum waiting at the other end, and the 2 relatives at the centre of it were treated as nothing more than names on a policy that had to become names on a death certificate. On the 23rd of March 2019, the 2 victims were shot and killed in their home with automatic rifles. To almost anyone looking in from the outside, it appeared to be a violent home invasion by unknown attackers. But the killing had been ordered and paid for by a member of the family. The case might have stayed unsolved if not for the weapon. The rifle used in the murders was later tied through ballistics to a separate killing, a man shot dead in another Free State town earlier that same year. When the hitman Malefi Molise was arrested in the town of Fouriesburg, police recovered an automatic rifle whose forensic signature matched all of it. That single weapon connected the dots, linking the 2 deaths near Thaba and Chu to the earlier shooting and putting police on the path to the man who had pulled the trigger. From there it was a short step to the woman who had set the whole thing in motion. Once investigators had Molise, the trail led back to the one who had hired him and who held the policies on the 2 victims. The motive was written into the paperwork. Kaletsang Motladile had insured the very people she had arranged to have killed. When the case reached the Free State High Court, the roles were laid out plainly. Molise was the gun for hire, facing several counts of murder, along with charges tied to the weapon he carried. Kaletsang was the one who had planned it, insured the victims, and paid for their deaths. The prosecution walked the court through the paperwork and the payments, showing how the policies, the fee, and the killings all traced back to the same woman. In February of 2024, Kaletsang Motladile was sentenced to 30 years in prison for the 2 murders. Malefi Molise, the hitman who pulled the trigger, was sentenced to life. The prosecution used the case to highlight a disturbing pattern that keeps surfacing in these insurance killings. A person takes out policies on relatives who trust them, quietly names themselves as the one who benefits, and then arranges for those relatives to die on schedule. The victims often have no idea that the paperwork binding them to a loved one has quietly become a death warrant. For the family of Lasang and Bongani Motladile, the cruelty ran deeper than the violence itself. They had been marked for death by one of their own, someone who sat at the same tables and attended the same gatherings, and who all the while had been calculating exactly how much their lives were worth on an insurance form. A mother and her son, killed in the place they should have felt safest, so that a relative could turn their funerals into a windfall. Cases like theirs are part of why prosecutors in South Africa have grown so wary of families where the grief and the paperwork seem to arrive together. Keletsang Motladile hired a stranger and kept her own hands clean. Our next daughter also insured a relative and reached for a neighbour to do the killing, but she did not stay away when the moment came. She was there in the room when her uncle died. One quick thing. Subscribing is free. It takes a second, and it makes sure the next case comes straight to you. Case 9. Nompelo Maloyi. She was her uncle's caregiver, the person he trusted to look in on him and bring his groceries. She was also the person who had quietly taken out insurance on his life. When he was found bound and beaten in his home, everyone assumed a robbery. Only later did the truth come out, that his own niece had promised a neighbour 20,000 rand to help her kill him. In Graaf-Reinet, a town in the Eastern Cape of South Africa, a 66-year-old man named Meinhard Maloyi was murdered in his own home, on the kind of quiet township street where neighbours know one another and an older man expects to grow old in peace. The person behind it was the niece he trusted most, a 37-year-old woman named Nompelo Maloyi, who acted as his caregiver and had positioned herself to profit from his death. She was the one who came and went from his home, the one who looked after him as he aged, the one nobody would think twice about seeing at his door. That trust was exactly what she used against him. Nompelo had taken out insurance policies on her uncle, worth around 165,000 rand. To collect, she needed him gone, and she was willing to do most of the work herself. What she needed was a second pair of hands, so she turned to a neighbour, a man named Yithelwazi K, and promised him 20,000 rand to help. On the night of the 25th of November 2022, Nompelo left her child with a neighbour and went to her uncle's home with K, who was carrying a knife. As his caregiver, she had easy access to the house. Once inside, the two of them bound the older man's hands and feet with shoelaces, struck him on the head, and stabbed him. He did not survive the attack, and he died there in the home where he had trusted his niece to keep him safe. The next morning, Nompelo played the part of the concerned niece, asking a neighbour to check on her uncle under the excuse of dropping off groceries, so that someone else would be the one to find the body. At first, the scene suggested a robbery and a struggle, an older man overpowered by intruders who had come for whatever they could take. What undid Nompelo was a mix of her own greed and her own mouth. After the killing, she moved to claim on the insurance policies, which drew attention, and the arrangement with her hired neighbour fell apart when Kay, feeling he had not been paid what he was owed, began to threaten her. Rather than settle the debt, Nompelo started looking for someone who could make Kay disappear as well, which meant the plot that began with one hired killing was already spiralling toward another. Greed had a way of feeding on itself, and hers was pulling more and more people toward danger. The case broke open after her arrest. Sitting in custody, Nompelo confessed the whole thing, without being pressed, to a fellow detainee, laying out details that lined up with the evidence investigators had already gathered. It was a remarkable break for the officers on the case, who had been building it piece by piece, from the insurance claims, to the recruited neighbour, to the falling out over money. Her own mouth handed them the final confirmation, and her own words sealed the case against her. When it went to trial in the High Court, Nompelo Maloyi was convicted of premeditated murder. Both she and Yithelwazi K, the neighbour she had pulled into the plot, were sentenced to more than 2 decades in prison, a term of around 26 years each. Prosecutors were not satisfied even with that, and signalled they might push for a heavier sentence, arguing that the planned killing of a vulnerable elderly relative for insurance money deserved the harshest punishment the law allowed. To the state, a woman who had bound and killed the uncle she was trusted to care for, purely to cash in policies on his life, had earned life imprisonment, and anything less risked sending the wrong message about how seriously these betrayals are taken. Minhart Malloy had done nothing but grow old and lean on the family around him. He was 66, at a stage of life when a person should be able to trust the relative who brings the groceries and checks that the doors are locked. Instead, that very trust became the thing that got him killed. The details that stayed with people were the small, intimate betrayals. She was the niece who brought her uncle his groceries, the person he leaned on as he got older, the one family member he should have been safest with. And she had used that trust as a key, letting herself into his home to help bind him, beat him, and take his life for a payout she had arranged in advance. Nompello Malloy killed one relative for one payout. The woman who closes out this list turned that same scheme into a way of life. Over 6 years, she insured relative after relative, and then had them killed one by one. And she very nearly got away with all of it. Case 10. Rosemary Ndlovu. She was a police officer, someone the community was supposed to be able to trust. Over 6 years, one relative after another around her died, and each time she collected on a life insurance policy she had taken out on them. What finally stopped her was a hitman she tried to hire for her next killing, a man so horrified by what she asked that he walked straight into a police station. Namia Rosemary Ndlovu was a sergeant in the South African Police Service, stationed near Tembisa in Gauteng. She was, on paper, one of the good guys, a woman who wore the uniform and had sworn to protect people. In truth, she ran one of the most chilling insurance murder schemes the country has ever seen, and she ran it against her own family. The pattern was always the same. Rosemary would take out life and funeral policies on a relative, naming herself as the one who would collect. Then that relative would die, often violently, and the payout would come to her. Over roughly 6 years, between 2012 and 2018, she collected more than 1.4 million rand this way, one dead loved one at a time. Each payout was staggering in size. After her sister Audrey died, Rosemary collected more than 700,000 rand. When her boyfriend Maurice Mabasa was killed, she took in hundreds of thousands more. Every death was a deposit, and the family around her was being cashed in, name by name. Her victims were her own blood and the man who loved her. A cousin named Witness Homu was among the first to die, back in 2012. A niece and 2 nephews were killed in the years that followed. Her boyfriend, Maurice Mabasa, the father of her child, was stabbed dozens of times and left dumped near a police station. One of the nephews, Brilliant Mashego, was her late sister's son, and he had confronted Rosemary about the insurance money from his mother's death before he too ended up dead. Her sister Audrey was poisoned and strangled, and Rosemary was later convicted of tampering with the scene where she died. Most of the killings, though, she carried out the way the daughters throughout this list did. She hired men to do it, and pointed them at the people who trusted her. For years it worked, because the deaths looked separate and unconnected. A cousin here, a boyfriend there, a niece, a nephew. Each one a tragedy that on its own looked like violence or bad luck, and each one quietly making Rosemary richer. What brought it all down was her own appetite for more. In 2018, Rosemary approached a man to carry out her next job, wanting her surviving sister and that sister's 5 children killed and their home burned down with them inside. The man she approached was so sickened by what she was asking that instead of taking the money, he went to the police. Working with police, an undercover officer then posed as the hitman and wore recording equipment, capturing Rosemary on both audio and video as she laid out exactly what she wanted done. She drove for hours to the family home, bought petrol along the way, and gave detailed instructions to kill the family and leave no one alive. It was all recorded. There was no explaining it away. When Rosemary Ndlovu finally stood trial at the High Court in Johannesburg, the scope of what she had done stunned the country. In 2021, she was convicted of 6 murders, along with multiple counts of fraud tied to claims she had filed with several different insurers, attempted murder, and a string of related charges for the plot that had been caught on tape. She had also tried to have her own mother killed. Throughout the trial, she insisted she was innocent, even as the recordings played and the payouts were traced back to her. The judge compared her to Daisy DeMelka, one of the most infamous poisoners in the nation's history. In November of 2021, Rosemary Ndlovu was sentenced to 6 terms of life imprisonment, 1 for each murder, along with decades more for the other crimes. Even then, she insisted she was innocent, and she has remained behind bars ever since. The people she was supposed to love became line items on insurance forms. A sister, a cousin, a boyfriend, a niece and nephews, a mother she tried to add to the list. Rosemary Ndlovu wore a badge that meant she had promised to protect people, and she spent 6 years hunting the very family who trusted her most, paying strangers to do the killing and collecting the money once the funerals were over. Her case became one of the most talked about in the country, the subject of documentaries and lasting disbelief that a person sworn to protect the public had instead hunted her own family for profit. 10 daughters, 10 families, and the same unthinkable choice sitting at the centre of every one. Each of these women looked at the people who raised her, or trusted her, or loved her, and decided that a stranger with a weapon was worth more than their lives. If these are the kinds of cases that stay with you the way they stay with us, subscribe so the next investigation finds you, and we will see you on the next case.